VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And welcome to Crosstalk here on the VCY American Network. Good to have you here with us today as we are going to be sharing some information that you probably will not find as you put on your nightly newscast here tonight as it relates to a arms treaty conference that's coming to New York that is going to be dealing with, well, the United Nations. It's going to be taking a look at limiting firearms and having a grave impact upon Second Amendment rights. Did you know that the State Department is pushing this? Did you know that our own Attorney General for the United States actually talked about needing to brainwash people as it relates to their thinking about guns? Well, we'll be talking about many, many issues today here pertaining to the UN Arms Trade Treaty, as well as some related matters that are impacting us across the nation. It's our privilege to have back with us on Crosstalk Larry Pratt, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America. Larry, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. Really appreciate being with you.
Larry, we're just 3 months away. A conference coming up in July, the UN Arms Trade Treaty Conference, otherwise known as ATT. What can you tell us about this conference? What can you tell us about the treaty?
Well, it's something that Hillary Clinton, now the Secretary of State, announced early on in this administration. It was one of her pet projects, something that she's been striving to do for a long time, assuming that somehow she's going to hornswoggle the Senate into voting for gun control. Now, she can sign the treaty or get the president to sign it, but I don't see the Senate ratifying such an act. The real concern, I think, we shouldn't say, oh, well, then there's nothing to worry about. The real concern is that there's a parallel to the concept that the socialists in our country have promoted as a living, breathing, evolving constitution. Mm-hmm. The word in international speak is norming. They look at how many thug and rogue regimes have signed on to some treaty, agreement, concord, whatever, and say, oh, well, there's 60, 70, 80, whatever, pick a number. That's become an international norm, and as an international norm, we've got to comply with what is now part of the body of international law. And so you see how they kind of define their way sideways into making it a law. Well, it may be an international law, but it sure isn't one in the United States because it doesn't have that authority of the constitutional authority required. So what their game is to use bureaucrats to enforce these international norms. And it's not going to happen right away in an arms control treaty that is not going to be approved by our Senate. But I would say a year or two, whatever, after they've been satisfied that quote unquote enough countries have made it a norm. But then, if Obama were in power, and God help us if he is, then he would have his State Department begin to enforce through licensing schemes and registration and so forth that we assume is likely to be in this treaty. It would also mean the confiscation of non-civilian weapons, which is one of the favorite targets of gun controllers that we're assuming would be in this treaty. And so that would be the danger that we face, and that's why it's not only important to, just because I said the Senate's not likely to approve it, the Senate and the House need to be encouraged to defund any activity of the Department of State, the Department of Justice, the Department of the Interior, of any of the federal agencies, certainly the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the FBI, that would be involved in implementing through the back door gun control treaties. They just need to know that they have no money to do that.
We're going to look at some of those specifics, but Larry, I understand that this treaty and the arms trade treaty, I mean, they go so far to even define manufacturing so broadly that any gun owner who adds so much as a scope or changes a stock on a firearm would be required to obtain a manufacturing license. That
is something that we think might be in there. This is the wish list that the antis have had for everything short of an actual ban. And, of course, we expect some guns would be banned that are currently owned. You know, the famous 1945 model Colt 45 caliber or any of the number of like firearms to it. All those would be banned because they are would be considered a military caliber and something that a mere civilian would not be able to have. And, of course, there goes civilian ownership of AK-47s and AR-15s, because those are clearly military-style weapons, and we can't have that.
Larry, as you mentioned, Secretary Clinton, she has been a longtime advocate for such a treaty, and there was a statement that came out from our State Department a few years back saying the United States is committed to actively pursuing a strong and robust treaty that contains the highest possible legally binding standards for the international transfer of conventional weapons. They've also been promoting this as an international gun sales check to fight against terrorism, insurgency, international crime syndicates. We keep hearing this buzz terminology come from them. What's your response to that?
That's the background chatter. That's going to be used to justify administrative actions, but they're strictly limited to doing things illegally through the back door. And I think we need to point out to them that their dream of civilian disarmament doesn't work. It doesn't keep governments from getting out of control, and in many worse cases, governments have become murderously oppressive because they thought that they could push people around any which way they wanted because people wouldn't be able to resist them effectively. And so the idea that we don't need our guns in this enlightened 21st century time overlooks the fact that government hasn't changed. In fact, the only change in government has been it's continued to get bigger and less constitutionally justified in what it's doing, and it's time for us not only to stick to our guns, but to start putting the government on a serious diet.
If this treaty were ratified, describe for us what you believe the extent of the gun control environment would create here in the U.S.
Well, you'd be looking at whatever they could get away with if we didn't have a Congress that would defund them and perhaps defund their positions so that they were not able to carry them out. If they actually were able to be busy little bees, I could see them, at least in willing states such as Massachusetts and California, getting bureaucrats there to work with them to enforce this. And one of our best pushbacks, I believe, is something that's been happening under the radar in counties around the country where sheriffs have been coming forth to interpose themselves between the feds and the people of their county. In Indiana, for example, I know the sheriff there personally. He's a member of Gun Owners of America. Brad Rogers had to deal with the FDA. A farmer in his county is producing, happily I can say is producing, raw milk that the FDA really has a thing about. In a county in Wisconsin where the sheriff didn't understand his responsibility, they put a dairy farmer out of business because he was selling raw milk. They literally came in and stole his equipment. Well, they were going to do the same thing in Elkhart County, Indiana, and Sheriff Rogers said, if you try to put even 1 foot on his property, I'll arrest you. And somebody emailed him back from an attorney at the FDA and said, well, if you do that, we'll arrest you. And to which, in so many words, Sheriff Rogers replied, game on. And as a result, that has kept the feds at bay, where they know the sheriff is willing to tell them, you don't have any constitutional authority to do this, so I'll arrest you for doing something that you don't have the authority to do. In some New Mexico counties and Oregon and California counties, sheriffs have told the Forest Service that, we're going to let people cut those trees down around a village on top of the Rockies there in southern New Mexico. Otherwise, a dry summer, which we had last summer, which is when the county ordinance was passed, permitting the cutting of huge swath of trees. Otherwise, the village could have been burned down had there been a forest fire and there was no adequate fire break. In other cases, the feds have wanted to close off roads through national forests because they basically hate the utilization of the earth, and they are clearly in direct opposition to the commandment that we multiply and have dominion over the earth. We're supposed to be cultivating the earth. We're supposed to treat it the way Adam and Eve treated the garden in those first however many hours or days when they were in a right relationship with God. And that's the objective that we should have for our stewardship of the earth now, whether it be mining or foresting or anything else. So the sheriffs really play a key role, and if there were a UN treaty that said guns are going to be confiscated, a sheriff could just simply say, well, there won't be any confiscation going on in my county. There'll be some arrests of you guys, but there won't be any confiscations.
Larry Pratt with us here today in Crosstalk. You mentioned that with this arms trade treaty conference coming up in July, that you just don't see right now a 2/3 vote coming together by the Senate to ratify this. But at the same time, you kind of expressed some concern that the president, even by means of this expanding power of the executive order, again, non-constitutional, do you fear that may be attempted to be used to push us toward the tenets of this treaty?
Sure. You could have jurisdictions that are big government jurisdictions, either whole states like California and Massachusetts, or cuckoo cities like Chicago, Illinois, or New York, where they would play along. And if they got an edict, an executive order, Mayor Bloomberg would find nothing more wonderful than to have an order to confiscate all the known guns in New York City. Happily, most of the guns in New York City are not known to his honor, but there are people that even have carry permits, maybe 1,000 out of, 8 million. And there are other people that have permits to own a gun, be it a handgun or a long gun, and primarily they're only able to take it out of their abode when they are going to a range. And there's really no other purpose for it legally now in New York City. They'd love to confiscate the gun.
Larry Pratt is with us here today on Crosstalk. We're going to take a quick break and come back to more talk and discussion here on the UN Arms Trade Treaty and some related issues going on as well. This is Crosstalk on VCY America.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, creation scientist and author with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, the world is full of beautiful things that we can see all around us, but it also has some ugly things as well.
Yes, indeed it does, Chris. The creation that we see is full of parasites and diseases, cancers and tumors. These are not the things that would have been part of the original very good creation. Soon after creation, Adam and Eve rejected God's authority and incurred on them the penalty of sin, which was the death penalty on all of creation. It was the presence of death which caused Darwin to deny the existence of God and look for a natural explanation of all things. It's also the reason many evolutionists give for accepting evolution. But creationist thinking starts with a very good world ruined by sin and redeemed by the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And that makes scientific sense too. You see, that's the Back to Genesis story from beginning to end.
You can find us on the web at www.icr.org.
In just 3 months, coming up, a UN Arms Trade Treaty Conference coming to New York, and something that's been long time advocated by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And there are also some thoughts here from the Attorney General, Larry Pratt, with us here today from Gun Owners of America. Larry, Attorney General Eric Holder, 1995, he talked about the use of various resources behind a campaign to, quote, really brainwash people into thinking about guns in a vastly different way. What's he referring to here?
The Attorney General is referring to the way he looks at you and me. He looks at himself as part of the self-appointed ruling class, and he looks at you and me, all the rest of us, as the class to be ruled. And these statements about we need to be brainwashed, we need to have our guns taken away, all of this reflects the effort on the part, and all too many Republicans are part of this problem as well, that the people can't be trusted, that they need to be controlled, and that not only do we need gun control, but we need all these other regulations that come spewing out of Washington like dirty water out of sewer. And they just really believe that this is the way it ought to be, that they somehow are smart enough to make the millions of decisions that are made by us little worker bees on our own, making such a mess of things as they see it, and that somehow all those millions of decisions that are made every minute of every day will be made better by a handful of self-appointed rulers. And I think when you put it that way, it becomes fairly obvious that these people must be smoking something. They believe their own propaganda clearly, and they're just flat out wrong. What they're saying has never worked. It's always resulted in human misery, poverty, government murder of swaths of the population. And when that was brought to Senator Edward Kennedy's attention years ago by Milton Friedman, both of these men are now deceased. Milton Friedman was a very well-known University of Chicago economist, and he gave Kennedy, during a hearing, kind of a little history lesson, showing him that every single country where these socialist proposals had been tried had resulted in these horrible consequences. And after the little lesson ended, Senator Kennedy said, the right people were not in charge. And so, it's going to be different with me this time. And clearly, that's the point of view that the president has expressed, that we are the ones under our stewardship, the seas will go down. And
Yeah. Say, March 29th, 2012, Business Insider reported that the Department of Homeland Security and its Immigration Custom Enforcement Office, ICE, is getting an indefinite delivery of an indefinite quantity of the .40 caliber bullets from the defense contractor ATK, that U.S. agents will receive a maximum of 450 million rounds over 5 years. Is there any truth to this, and doesn't that seem like an extraordinary amount of ammunition?
An extraordinary amount, and as far as we can tell, nobody's denied it. And that kind of makes you think that, those are their plans. Now, I'm not sure what specific plans we can impute to that, but I can tell you that if nothing else, it shows you just how much money they're willing to spend, even if they don't really have any particular plans in mind. Government equals waste, and for us to allow them to make purchases like that, with the possible more sinister implications that could be behind that, is something that we'd better not do. We'd better cut their money off, and we'd better do it quickly. The problem that we have is that people like John Boehner and Mitch McConnell, the leader of the House, the leader of the Senate, Republicans, don't have backbones. They will not fight. They will not when there are certain crunch times when to keep the government running, a positive vote must occur to extend the spending spree that is currently what is really going on with our government. And when given those opportunities to say, we'll go along with extending the debt, raising the debt up to whatever point we can negotiate, but it's only going to happen. We're only going to make that agreement at that lower point than what you want if Obamacare is put in with a complete overturning, and if this, that, and whatever other things that might be on the agenda, a lot of things that would be pro-Second Amendment, but a lot of other things that could be put in there as well. Otherwise, when we get to the point where there's no more money, we're just going to let you guys have a furlough of some 43% of the federal government. 57% will be able to continue operating from revenues, tax revenues that come in every month here in Washington. It's really hard to kill this monster,
Yeah.
So, but the notion that was never messaged by Boehner and Company during the confrontation that turned out not to be a confrontation over the debt limit last year. So we have people that are not willing to go out and explain to the American people, look, Social Security checks are going to be written if we don't come to an agreement by whatever, I think it's the end of the fiscal year is the deadline this year. So it would be the last day of September. If they don't come up with a new budget and extend the deficit or make some really huge cuts, which of course would be the sensible thing to do, that's why I haven't spent much time talking about it, then we're just going to let things go to level 57% and keep talking about 57%. 57%. The checks will go out to the veterans as well, and we can decide what other things are truly essential to keep people that have been depending on government largesse to know that their dip into our pockets will be able to continue. And that seems to me the way they could and should deal with it. And I think the American people, as every month has gone by, are more and more alarmed with the growth of government, with the cost of government, the fact that these guys just don't seem to be able to push back from the table. They just sit there like a 500-pound slug and keep ramming the food down the big throat. And we've got to tell Republicans as well as Democrats, Republicans in primaries, you know what? You apparently didn't get the message of 2010. So we're going to try to get somebody in as a Republican who does get the message of 2010, because we don't want you doing a job that you really don't understand. And clearly you've shown you don't understand, and or you're not willing.
Larry,
That's John Boehner's problem. He's symptomatic of the whole thing.
Let me ask you about here as it relates to this UN Arms Trade Treaty and what's coming up here in July. Comment on a couple of these bills that have been introduced. In one, we have the U.S. House of Representatives, H.R. 3594, introduced this past December, called the Second Amendment Protection Act, that expresses a sense of Congress the U.S. should not adopt any treaty that poses a threat to national sovereignty or abridges any rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, like the right to keep and bear arms. Also calls for the pulling of funding from the UN unless the President certifies that the UN is not restricting or attempting to restrict our right to keep and bear arms. And but from December 7th to today, there's only 32 co-sponsors on this legislation. Then on March 19th, just a couple weeks back, the U.S. Senate, there was a bill introduced, S-2205, called the Second Amendment Sovereignty Act of 2012, that prohibits funding to negotiate a UN arms trade treaty that restricts our Second Amendment rights of citizens. But since that was introduced just over 2 weeks ago, there's only 3 senators, Jerry Moran of Kansas, John Boozman of Arkansas, and Rand Paul of Kentucky, that have put their names on this legislation, 3 out of 100. Can you comment on these bills? Are these pro-gun bills, pro-sovereignty bills, pro-limited government bills, or are there some other issues going on here?
No, they are as you describe. I think you've correctly characterized the bills. The one in the House, frankly, should be a no-brainer for a politician because it's only a proposal for a statement by the Congress. It's not proposed as legislation. And so they're not really willing to take that kind of a step. I think the Congress is failing because of their lack of leadership. They have elected a leader who doesn't want to lead. And until we get somebody to reflect the will of the voters back in 2010, and I suspect will be the will of the voters again this year, we're going to just see this thing drift. Right now we're being told, well, we can't really get it through the Senate. Well, really, we can. We have gotten pro-Second Amendment legislation through the Senate. It passed the House, and then the measure overturning the ban on firearms in national parks went over to the Senate. Now, of course, Harry Reid didn't call it up for a vote in regular order, but the rules of the Senate make it fairly easy for somebody to lie in wait, and when they find a bill that the Democrats view as must-pass, put that thing on that must-pass legislation, and away it went. In the case of the park ban being overturned, it was a horrible credit card bill that the president wanted when he was bailing things out and all that kind of thing early on. And so he signed a pro-Second Amendment piece of legislation. Yeah, there were a lot of other things, but we weren't in a position to stop that in the Democrat Congress. But we were able to put it on as an amendment. Senator Coburn did that in the Senate. The same thing could be done right now in Harry Reid's Senate. And so since the votes are clearly there in both bodies for constitutional carry, for overturning UN activities in gun control area, it's just a matter of putting it on a quote-unquote must-pass bill, usually some kind of an appropriation bill, and voila, you've got something that the president will sign, because were he not to sign it, one of his favorite pet projects would be going down the tubes. Money would be cut off for the UN, or money would be cut off for the State Department, or the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and or maybe the entire Justice Department. However, the Republicans might to play it broadly or narrowly. And they have the ability to do that. They can send bills over from the House to the Senate with that kind of provision. In the Senate, they could make amendments on the floor because rules enable senators to do things like that.
Larry, before the break here, as a point of action, what can people do specifically in regard to this treaty here?
Ask members of Congress to cut off the funding for any bureaucratic activity, primarily in the State Department, that would promote the signing of this treaty. That's a very effective tool. These folks don't volunteer.
Larry Pratt is with us today from Gun Owners of America. Let's open our phone lines. Our number 800-733-9829. If you have a question or comment, 800-733-9829. And immediately after the break, we're going to get Larry's perspective on the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin issue in Florida. We'll be right back.
Many churches are abandoning the old hymns of the faith. Yet these very hymns are a rich treasure trove of biblical truth, and unless we pass them on to the next generation, they will be lost. In the book, Then Sings My Soul, Volume 3, author Robert Morgan provides more than 50 devotional-style stories about hymns through the ages. You'll learn the stories and backgrounds to the hymns that have blessed us, including It Is Well With My Soul, In Times Like These, How Great Thou Art, The Old Rugged Cross, and many more. The book also includes the music for each of the hymns, spanning over many decades. It's ideal for family devotions and for personal enrichment. To obtain your copy of Then Sings My Soul, Volume 3, send a donation of $23 or more to VCY America, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. To make your donation by phone, call 1-800-729-9829, 1-800-729-9829.
listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America. Larry Pratt is with us, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America. And we're bringing up the UN Arms Trade Treaty Conference coming to New York in July. It's abbreviated ATT. But talking about potential aspects of, implicating those across this nation who have the constitutional right to keep and to bear arms, issues pertaining to matters like micro-stamping, issues pertaining to the ban on certain types of firearms, certain types of ammunition, demanding the mandatory destruction of surplus ammo and confiscated firearms. On and on the concerns are listed regarding the treaty. It's not something that the media is stoking the flames at this point. But, Laurie, before we go to the phone calls here today, we certainly would like you just to briefly comment on a story that's coming out of Sanford, Florida. The issue is your stand your ground laws that are part of Florida and other states' statutes, but specifically the situation of George Zimmerman and the incident with Trayvon Martin. Are there elements of this story that the American people are not being told?
There has been a very obvious, it turns out now, effort by the media to twist this and to even lie about what happened. They were hoping, you could tell, without any leaked sources saying, yes, we're going to use this to go after gun owners, but that clearly was what they were hoping, because they do this every time they think they've got some kind of use of a firearm that they can work against the Second Amendment. The problem that they're having is that with the new media, with talk shows certainly like this one with so many listeners, with the Internet, people can go to gunowners.org and get information from our site. They can get it from all kinds of other places. And what we see is something that is not what the Democrat media, the so-called mainstream media, has been promoting as what happened, but you see a very different story. Rather than a racist running down a sweet young black child and just executing him like a dog, we find that, first of all, Zimmerman was some kind of strange racist because he was tutoring black kids on the weekend. He had a black friend defend him ardently on CNN, and his brother, who of course is his brother, but both of these gentlemen said the same sorts of things, that Zimmerman was not somebody with a temper problem. He was a guy that was just plain decent to everybody, and he had been part of the unorganized, loose-knit neighborhood watch system in his gated community for some time, and had actually, his efforts in the past had led to the apprehension and incarceration of a thief. So not somebody that was reckless or out of control. What seems to be the case from the information that's now corroborated by witnesses, not just Zimmerman's account, is that he did get out of his truck. He called 911, explained what was happening, and said, I'm following this guy in a hoodie. And he was asked, well, can you tell us what he looks like? Is he white, Hispanic, black? And his answer was, I think he's black. NBC, in their rendering of that 911 call, said, well, I'm following this guy who's behaving kind of suspiciously, dressed in a hoodie. I think he's black. That's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. It makes that seem like I wouldn't have cared about the guy if he were white, but since he's black, I'm suspicious. What's he doing in my neighborhood? So that blew up happily in NBC's face. The guy that was immediately responsible for it has been fired. I've noticed, however, that all the other people that would have had to have known about this and have done nothing to stop it have not been fired. So they threw the one guy off the bus, hoping that would satisfy, and of course the rest of their buddies in the media are not going to make anything of it. So it's up to those of us able to utilize the alternate media to make these points and to show that Mr. Zimmerman actually was the victim. What we know from witnesses, is that Zimmerman had been accosted from behind. Now, that much we don't have, that I know of, an eyewitness. But we do know from at least two eyewitnesses, that Zimmerman was on the ground, face up, with Martin on top of him, pounding his head away, and that was corroborated by the police report, saying that he had a bloody nose and he was bleeding in the back of his head because Martin had been not only pounding his fists into the front of his face, but he had been hammering Zimmerman's head on the concrete, left a nice little gash, which you could see in the police station surveillance tape as Zimmerman's being walked in, handcuffed, not let go right on the spot. The guy was in custody, but not charged, but he was in custody for 5 hours. And I don't know when the cuffs came off, sometime during the time he was in the station, but he was cuffed at the scene. He was put in the back of a squad car, cuffed, taken to the station, and you see him coming in a single file between a number of police officers. There's George Zimmerman with his hands cuffed behind his back. So the idea that somehow, wink, wink, nod, nod, no problem here, just keep moving along, nothing to see. No, it looks like the police did a very thorough job. They ended up with 6 witnesses on the police report. Those names have been blacked out, but there are 6 witnesses, witness 1, witness 2, etc. And a TV reporter in Orlando actually found one of the witnesses, and he said the same thing to the station that the police said. He said to them, the guy's name is John, is all we know. He was actually outside, standing near where the altercation was occurring, corroborated that Zimmerman had cried out for help. Zimmerman himself said he had been crying out for help, but nobody would come. And a 13-year-old also had been an eyewitness, and so 2 of the 6 we know about. And everybody so far has been saying the same thing, and we have no reason to think that the others wouldn't have seen the same thing. Although it's true that in war and in crime scenes, witnesses can see the same thing in a different way. So sure. Until we see what the other 4 accounts are, we can't say with certainty.
A lot of judgment going on, though, without that certainty taking place. And I think we need to let that story really develop as to what happened, what did not happen.
There'll be a hearing coming up in a week or two. That will require the prosecution to present whatever evidence they have, and it may be that they're going to present exculpatory evidence. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to wait too long, and then we're going to find out exactly a lot more, with a lot more certainty, what did happen.
By the way, folks, in regard to this UN Arms Trade Treaty, AT&T coming to New York, this treaties are ratified by the U.S. Senate. You can let your voice be made known to your U.S. senators. The number to the Senate is 202-224-3121. That's 202-224-3121. Let's go to the state of Florida. Steve, go ahead. You're on the air.
Thank you, Jim. You read the story earlier about the DHS getting 450 million rounds of ammunition. Your audience needs to understand that these are hollow point bullets. They're described as frangible rounds. They break apart when they hit walls. There's no ricochet. They're made for close quarters combat. That's when they kick in your doors. That's close quarters combat. ATK, the company that makes these rounds, their own literature states that these rounds have, quote, optimal penetration for terminal performance. Simply stated, it means it will stop any object dead in its tracks. Again, this is for close quarters combat. This is what they have planned. And I'm going to remind your audience of Revelation 20. It talks about cowards. they end up in the lake of fire along with murderers, etc. God bless you.
Okay, thank you.
He's quite right about the nature of that ammunition. They're designed not only to not ricochet or over-penetrate, but to cause the maximum shock by their expanding or even falling apart inside a person's body. And with that shock then comes a loss of consciousness and often death, so that the person is rendered helpless within seconds of being shot with one of these rounds. And the likelihood of death following is pretty good, because even if you don't die in the first couple of seconds, you probably will bleed out.
And again, this is not U.S. military. This is the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office.
Yeah, this is headed up by the same gal whose Department of Homeland Insecurity had published a manual earlier in this administration pointing out that people like you and I, Christians, conservatives, pro-Second Amendment, pro-life, these are potential terrorists, and police should be on the lookout. So if you see a pro-Constitution piece of literature in the back seat of a guy's car when you pull him over, man, you better unlatch the latch on your holster, and really be ready for trouble. These are the people that we really need to watch out for. Not a word in that report was said about Muslim extremists, and the fact that the Quran itself states that infidels, if they won't convert, need to be put to death. So,
let's go to Germantown, and Claire, you're on the air. Good afternoon.
Yes. I've been calling Cole. He has an office in Milwaukee. Here's the number.
What is the comment, Claire, on the issue, without giving numbers, because we have people in all different states listening?
And what I say is, please do not sign any United Nations treaties, period.
Okay, not to ratify them. Okay, he would not be a signatory as such, but he would be that which would ratify it. Thank you, Claire. To Exonia, Anna, go ahead. You're on the air.
Hi. I have a grandfather that was a gunsmith. I have a cousin that's a gunsmith. I want to urge everybody to phone their local radio stations and alert them of the UN Arms Trade Treaty Conference, and call your senators. I mean, immediately. This is. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering here. I'm so. My family members and I own guns, and it's to us. We hunt. That's our meat. That's in our freezers also. It's definitely. Everybody stand up for what's right, and let your senators know, and your radio stations, let them know that this is going on.
Anna, you bring up a good point in that, Larry, too, we're not getting a whole lot of media attention about this UN issue.
The ABC News Radio, 212-456-5100, that we called before on an upcry of Christians. Phone your radio stations. Tell them about this treaty conference in New York.
Anna, thank you for your call here today. We're going to take a break and come back to more of your calls at 800-733-9829. Our guest today, Larry Pratt, and you can check out the website gunowners.org. We'll be right back.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewweekend.com. Continuing on our list of 20 characteristics of false teachers embraced by the false church. Number 3, false teachers openly reject truth. 2 Timothy 4:4 says, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. Isn't it interesting that the Bible tells us that many of the false teachers and those that follow them deliberately turn their ear away from hearing the truth? I think this goes right along with 2 Thessalonians 2:9-11, where we read, during the tribulation, God will give them over to this powerful delusion, so they will believe the lie. Why is God going to do this? Because it says in 2 Thessalonians 2:9-11, they refuse to love the truth and be saved. In other words, they've turned their ear away from truth. So false teachers openly reject truth. I'm Brandon House for the Worldview Weekend Minute. You can visit our website at worldviewweekend.com.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America. Larry Pratt with us here today on the program. And yes, folks, there is a UN arms trade treaty coming up in New York this coming July. And talking about those issues here today and related, 800-733-9829. Jerry, you're next from Wisconsin. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes, I wondered if this gentleman knew about the incident in, I believe it was Detroit, Michigan, that happened. I heard it on a guy filling in for another talk program, like a Rush Limbaugh type program, but it wasn't his. And he said that the guy was 76 years old, walking to get a bag of chips or something, and he was attacked by a bunch of black teenagers in Detroit, and it was payback for this, what happened to this Trayvon Hughes or whatever in Florida, and nobody's covering it. I don't hear anybody saying anything, and they said that he was severely beaten or he was killed.
He was left for dead. If that's the one that I'm thinking about, they actually there was another similar one where they had, I think it was outside, they'd encountered a woman, an old woman in her 80s, beat her to within an inch of her life, thrown her in the trunk of a car, and for 8 hours drove around displaying this old white woman to their black friends, and then ultimately threw her still alive over a bridge into the river. So there's some real hatred that's been stirred up, and I would lay that at the feet of the Democrats. They have, by making the statements that they made during the Trayvon Martin case, rushing to judgment, saying that he was gunned down because Zimmerman was a racist, when turns out that's just totally false, quite the contrary. But it was an opportunity to try to inflame things, and so far they've got a pretty good body count going for what they've done. The blood belongs on the hands of Jesse Jackson and people like that, Al Sharpton, who couldn't wait to rush down there, do a photo op, and threaten that things are going to reach a critical point, which I think was a fairly direct way of saying
has the media touched this? And what about our president? Has he apologized for any of this?
Well, he's actually come down on Zimmerman himself, so he has been just as irresponsible as Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. The radical left, which includes the president, have a real desire to pit race against race in this country, when the natural tendency of people in 21st century America is to simply look at other people as another person past the color of the skin. And if that ever gets out of control from their point of view, people being regarded as just other people and judged on their actions and their behavior rather than on the color of their skin, these race hustlers are out of business. I didn't even know that there were $1,600 suits, period. I'd heard of expensive ones at Joseph Banks going on sale to half price at $300. I did. And Jesse Jackson was one day identified as sporting his $1,600 suit.
Jerry,
I'll tell you what, hatred pays good money.
Thanks for your call there, Jerry. To North Point, Florida. Carlos, you're on the air.
Good afternoon. I'm calling to comment about the Trayvon Martin situation. And the last caller and your guest kind of hit it on the head. You know, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, I'm black, so let me preface this comment that I think that they are more hurtful, more harmful for race relations than any white person or anyone else out there. They haven't been relevant since the 1970s, and they take any opportunity to show up at these events and try to incite. Basically what they do is incite people to basically riot. And there was a case not that long ago here in Sarasota, Florida, where two white British tourists were shot by a black man, and it barely got any notice at all, and it was racially motivated, and yet there's no outcry, no outrage of that, or the black-on-black crime in inner cities. Why aren't they out there trying to get that to stop instead of, sticking their 2 cents in things that they really shouldn't have? Let the justice system do its work and stop inciting people to basically riot, and people like Spike Lee calling and giving out or tweeting and giving out addresses to this couple had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
You know, it just makes me angry. It really does. As a black man, I'm ashamed of them, you know, and what they're doing in the name of racial equality. It just really bothers me.
Thanks for recalling that Spike Lee episode. That was truly vile.
Carlos, thanks for your perspective. We appreciate your call.
Thank you, sir.
And our final call from Bosca Bell. And Brandon, go ahead. You're on the air.
Truly vile.
Hello, Brandon.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
I'm just against the gun because I inherited one of my grandpa's guns when he passed away a couple of years ago, and to give that up, it's just not right.
And many folk feel. Thank you for that call there, Brandon. Many people, Larry, are very concerned about that Second Amendment right that is provided them by the United States Constitution. It's not a military right. It is a personal right.
That's correct. There is a military aspect to it. It's the idea that we, the people, are to be armed so that we can keep our government under control. When veterans returned in 1946 to Athens, Tennessee, they found that the county and the city were just totally from top to bottom ridden with corrupt officials, fixing elections, and using the government process as a cash cow. So after they were on the verge of stealing the next election, the veterans collected the ballot boxes, took them to a secure place, or they tried to, but actually the corruptocrats beat them to the punch, took them inside the police station. The veterans then formed a spontaneous militia and began firing at the police station. And I think the movie account is fairly accurate. A couple of them, under the cover of that fire, got up to the front door of the police station, set some good-sized amount of dynamite, and set it off, thus forcing the rats to flee from a totally destroyed building. That's what the militia is for, when those kinds of things get out of hand.
Larry Pratt has been our guest today, gunowners.org. Larry, thanks for being with us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate you.
And, folks, reminder that this UN treaty, the conference coming up in July in New York, you can contact your senators, 202-224-3121. Thanks for joining us on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the Internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.